Hi, Jerry Anderson from Lorette is also an XP channel host and has been used by God to transform nations. In fact, if you want more information on how you can get involved with a roundtable in your area by just starting one, he's got all the material that you can download on his site at lorette.org. So you might want to go visit that at some point. But in a previous interview we did with Jerry Anderson, and you can find this on his channel or on the XP channel of videos, we discovered that Jerry was called into the prisons of Colombia. And it was interesting because when he first went in, he thought, well, God, I don't have a prison ministry, but he made himself available. And as a result, the prisons in Colombia were completely transformed from corruption into alignment with God's goodness through just teaching principles and values out of the book of Proverbs. Amazing. Well, then news about that transformation spread all over the place. And so now you're going to be introduced to a clip where we find that he went from prison to palaces.
After the Colombia Prison Project, maybe 4 years had passed, and there was a documentary film done on the prisons. Somehow this documentary film ended up in the palace of another nation. So it went from the prisons of one nation to the palace of another nation. It went to Guatemala. And I received a call from the Department of Justice. And it was a director that said, I've been placed in charge of 350 defense attorneys. She said, wow, she said, the corruption that we have. I was looking at this video, and could the same thing happen here with our attorneys that happened to the prisons of Colombia? And I said, yes, of course. Principles and values are principles and values. They work anywhere. She said, well, here's my problem. She said, when a policeman catches a bad guy here in the city of Guatemala, he takes him out to the prison, and we assign an attorney. Many times this attorney goes back to the house the same day to the mom and dad and says, Mom and Dad, your son's in so much trouble, but if I had this fee, I could get him out tonight. So they pay off a fee, and she said he goes back to the prison, pays off a few people, and now he's set free. She said in many cases the policeman sees him on the street a few days later and says, wow, I put my life on the line for that guy, and someone took a bribe. That's so unfair. So the next time he catches another bad guy, he puts him in the car, and rather than going to the prison, he goes out to the house. He cuts out the middleman. Mom and Dad, your son's in a lot of trouble. He's out in my car, and he's going to go to prison unless I had this fee. And if I had this fee, I could set him free tonight. In many cases, she said, it's an epidemic here in Guatemala, that the mom and dad says, wait a minute, you're in a police car, you're in a police uniform, we're going to tell on you. He feels like he has no choice but pull out his revolver and shoot and kill everybody in the house. Mom, dad, grandparents, children, anybody that was alive is now dead. She said, we have an epidemic. She said, I have no control of the police, but I do of the attorneys. Could you help? We brought the same Colombia trainers that's been teaching values and principles into the prisons of Colombia to the palace of Guatemala. 4 months later, 4 months, I receive a phone call and says, Jerry, would you come? Would you come to Guatemala? I have something for you to see. And it was a celebration. It was a breakfast with 40 attorneys from around the country. One by one, they stood up and said how their professional life had been changed, and how their wives had new husbands, and how their children had new papas, and how their neighbors had new neighbors. And it was truly a celebration. It was so emotional. About 2 months later, I'm back in Guatemala again, and was invited to do a large seminar for about 1,700 top business and political leaders. After the seminar, a man came to me with his card, and he said, we have to talk. And I looked, and it was a Supreme Court judge, one of 13, just like the United States, one of 13. I went to his quarters the next day, and he said, this is unfair, what you're doing. I said, unfair? He said, yes. He said, you're only working with half the courtroom. He says, as a judge, we're seeing such a change with the defense attorneys in the courtroom. He said, they're bringing the bad guy to the courtroom, and they're having him tell in detail of what they did wrong. We've never seen the truth in the courts of Guatemala. He said, we're seeing honesty. And then we're seeing the bad guy asking for forgiveness right there in the courtroom. That's why we send him to prison, to get him to that point. He said, we all need this. Wow. Over the next 6 months, I would go to Guatemala every other month trying to talk to another judge and another judge and another judge. And finally, July of 2007, standing on the stage in the Guatemala Supreme Court with the President of the Supreme Court and his 12 peers and 200 in the audience with the news cameras and newspapers. The President of the Supreme Court said, "This is a day of history for Guatemala." So we're not going to change our nation with more policemen, but with the minds of people through values and principles. And since I'm in charge of the justice system, he said, it starts with me. Please follow. Wow. This is a one-year program. They call it roundtables, where every employee, 7,200 in the justice system, came together 1 hour a week in small groups, 8 to 10 people, and they went through God's principles. Now, of course, they're stealth. We call them stealth. They don't have the Bible verse, but they're all out of Book of Proverbs. It's like productivity and honesty and attitude and hard work and savings. And it's the things that makes life work. I was just with the President of the Supreme Court last week, and he said, "Jerry," he said, "what a change in my employees." He said people used to come to work at 8, but they really didn't go to work till 10. He said they're here in the building till 4 or 4:30, but they quit around 2. He said now today, he said, they're working a full day and they're all a team, they're getting along and they're happy and they're excited about their job. He said, I can't walk through a building in any of the courtrooms throughout the country that I don't get stopped by some employee saying, "Wow, thank you for this. My life has been changed. I have a new wife, I have a new family, I have new neighbors, and I see things totally different through these values and principles." I believe it's the answer for what we need in the United States. It's what I'm seeing happen in the prisons, what I happen to see in the courtrooms of Guatemala. I believe God has shown us that whether it's from the bottom of the prisons to the top of the courtroom, that God can make a difference with His values, His principles. It was His plan from the very beginning.